Today what I'd like to talk about is Russia under the old regime, which is actually a play on Ancien Regime, the old regime in French, and oftentimes is the term that's applied to pre-1789, pre-revolutionary France, both by historians and certainly in the 19th century by contemporaries who were looking back on an age of monarchical rule in Europe. So Russia under the old regime, which is a convenient organizing title for the late imperial era before the First World War, is also, of course, a reference to an ancien regime society where autocracy continues to play a very central political and every other adjective role you can imagine, social, cultural, economic, and hence the films. You know, it's interesting actually to harken back to the themes from last week about the coming of modernity to an ancien regime, that by the time you get to the turn of the century, the historian, especially the historian who's poaching on the internet nowadays, can find not only photography but early video. So you know that there actually are movies available to see these folks, and in fact, if you really plunge around, because there's sound recording, although it's not hooked up with film quite yet, you can actually hear their voices. Last night, not this morning, last night actually for the very first time in my entire life, heard the voice of Nicholas II. Now this says something about how truly geeky historians actually are. You know, that's actually the highlight of my life, but I'll also admit that, you know, speaking personally, the elections didn't tilt in the direction that I was looking for, so not a comment beyond the fact that, you know, I was hunting around where I'm always more comfortable, I suppose, you know, in the early 20th century. And his voice is really loud. He's a really smallish man, but his voice is loud and almost powerful. So you saw some of that, and you saw some of the ancien regime, and you know, in the background, the Tsarist national anthem. And so today, really, what I'd like to talk about is Russia under the old regime, and get us, although I guarantee you this is going to be the whirlwind of whirlwinds, and get us to 1914, to the eve of the First World War, to what, you know, oftentimes Barbara Tuchman, perhaps most famously, called, you know, to the guns of August. And the outbreak, really, of a war that only in its aftermath was the war to end all wars. And it really was, historians would say, a war that, in fact, ended the age of empire and ended the Victorian era and actually ended this whole world that, in many ways, we're looking at, and initiated an entirely new one along with the new century that it marked. But to do that and get there, we have to think about 1881 to 1914. To periodize, and because, as we've seen here, I've been periodizing as contemporaries periodized by reign. So, you know, so one way briefly of thinking about the years that we're looking at is to think about the last three Romanov emperors. The grandfather, Alexander II, the son, Alexander III, Alexander Alexandrovich, and his son, the grandson, Nikolai Alexandrovich Nicholas II, sometimes, depending on your ideological perspective, called Nicholas the Last. Alexander, the great emancipator, was actually assassinated in March of 1881, an event that really had Kennedy-esque like implications for Russian society at the time, the same way that you can find Americans of, certainly of our generational experience, actually able to remember where they were when they heard the news of the Kennedy moment, of the Kennedy assassination. You can find similar sorts of themes and echoes, especially in the memoir literature and the correspondence of the late 19th century. The Tsar Emancipator actually assassinated by radical underground terrorists, and terrorism does in fact have its roots in the later 19th century in Europe. Political violence, which of course it has its own echoes back to the French Revolution, political violence as a political instrument, how to in fact change Russia, literally behead the beast. And this is in fact a metaphor with apocalyptic overtones to it. You want to actually get parts of what we're going to see in the next 2 lectures? Actually, skip the lectures and go read the book of Apocalypse. Go to the New Testament and read the book of Apocalypse, right? Because it's an interesting field of study, especially for philosophers who think about end times and eschatology. How do you escape from present reality? Well, one way of doing it is actually to assassinate the ruler. The son comes to the throne drenched, literally, well, not literally, but almost literally, in the blood of his father, and institutes an era that typically is called the counter-reforms, a conservative, even at times, depending on the historian who's analyzing it, a reactionary period, when many of the forward-looking, forward-thinking statesmen and policies and legislative acts of the previous decades of the 1860s and the 1870s are not so much reversed or countered as they're slowed or modulated with a reassertion of autocratic authority, with a reassertion of more traditional conservative agrarian values, with a reassertion in, language is important, with a reassertion of the special bond that tied Tsar to people. Although beyond these sorts of nebulous ideas, the 1880s sees the creation of a noble land bank, a bank that's established to give cheap credit to noble landowners who are attempting to make the transition out of serfdom and into a market economy. Sees an attempt to implement stricter police laws that are intended to bring order to a society that seems disorderly and inchoate and spinning out of control, so much so that young students would in fact conspire to murder the emperor successfully, to murder the emperor himself. Alexander dies prematurely in 1894. Alexander, it needs to be said, besides embarking on these conservative or reactionary, and the two words are very different, of course, policies, also sponsors the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and sponsors industrialization and mentors, this again I know because I've written about the guy, mentors and brings to power Sergei Witte, probably really the most far-sighted statesman of the late imperial regime, the arch-modernizer of the old regime. So, you go and figure out that psychological problem of how you get those two seemingly antithetical sets of ideas into one head. As soon as you can do that, actually, you can write the biography of Alexander III, which hasn't been written yet because no one really can figure it out. Plus, he doesn't write all that much. He doesn't even keep a diary. His son, on the other hand, who comes to the throne at the age of 26 and who's a copious diarist every single day, to the frustration oftentimes of many historians, because oftentimes, Nicholas famously would write about the weather or his children or his family. Most biographers would say that Nicholas was a man who actually didn't really like his job, although he loyally and dutifully, boy, there's a Romanov family theme, loyally and dutifully fulfilled it over the course of his entire long life. His diary entry on the day that his father died, though, was, my God, what will we do? Beloved, dearest, heatedly loved Papa has gone to his eternal rest. What will become of us? Which I suppose is what a 26-year-old might write, particularly one who, in fact, wasn't all that prepared for rule. His father, at least so the rumor mill in the Imperial Tsarist capital had it, and it was a very vicious rumor mill, especially in the upper reaches of the bureaucratic state and the imperial court. And because I've read the rumor mill by studying the guy who was at the center of it, Witte, the rumor mill had it that the father actually had a very low estimation of the son, at least at the time that he came to the throne. Unprepared, not particularly serious, in love with a ballerina, Ksheshenskaya. We saw her picture last time. My God, what will become of us? And even today, old women in St. Petersburg will remark upon the very bad signs and omens that accompanied the beginning of this reign, because in order to ensure his marriage, He went off to Hesse-Darmstadt and found his fiancée, Alex of Hesse, to become the Empress Alexander, brought her to the Crimea, to the palace in Livadia, to present her formally to his dying father, who approved of the marriage and announced the betrothal, and then he died, and the betrothed couple followed the corpse back to St. Petersburg, and in fact, in formal procession, accompanied the coffin to its place of display in the Winter Palace. This was considered to be a horrible omen in peasant Russia, to have a fiancée actually walking behind the corpse of her future father-in-law. More directly and less anecdotally, what we can say about the young man, Nicholas II, was that, as was the case with Nicholas I, or Alexander II, or Alexander III, Nicholas took it to be his fundamental responsibility to preserve his inheritance. And his inheritance was autocratic rule. And so here at the time of his coronation in May of 1895, delayed for almost a year because of concerns over state security, moderate to conservative nobles in provincial zemstva assemblies, these local elected councils that are looking after rural public infrastructure, are, of course, invited to the coronation. And they take advantage of the moment to suggest loyally to the sovereign that, after all, it's the beginning of a new reign. After all, people look to the beginning of the new reign for a turn from past policies. So that, after all, this is the moment, sire, to turn to your people and to summon representatives. Largely it meant us. Loyal, conservative, propertied, wealthy, noble men who would counsel in some sort of formal institutional assembly, but counsel, not with any legal or legislative right to act as a parliament, would counsel the emperor on matters of state. A consultative assembly is typically the way that it's dealt with in the literature, and this is Nicholas's answer. Now, I'm not here to say, boy, what an idiot Nicholas was. Actually, I completely understand what he's saying. And I completely understand him saying, these are senseless dreams. That idea begins a road that leads to the democratic, parliamentary, modern politics that you see in the West. And it leads to the chaos and the social disorder that you see in the West. Autocracy is not only my inheritance, autocracy is Russia's and the empire's foundation. To forget about that, to forget about, and here it is, the good of the whole nation, and thus to forget about the good of the whole nation and abandon the principle of absolute autocracy, i.e., I finally get to decide because I stand above all petty self-interest of group politics. He didn't say I stand above interest group politics, but that's what he was saying. And that was the advantage of autocracy, at least in its official ideology. So to offer that kind of idea, to move against it, that was a senseless dream. And after all, the young man said, I'm sure to himself, although here I'm making this up totally, right? That's what my father told me. I have been to his study in the Alexander Palace in Pushkin, outside of the capital city. And his study has been restored. And his study's done in Scandinavian wood. It's beautiful, actually, right? But you could be in Sweden or Finland. And looming over his desk, is a full-length, life-size portrait of his father. And his father was a monster, He was like way over 6 feet. And he prided himself. Look at this guy on my left. He prided himself on, and the court actually exploited for propaganda purposes because they were beginning to think in these sorts of ways. Propaganda wasn't the word that they used, on his connection to the people. Look, he looks just like a peasant. He dresses just like a peasant. Forget the medals. pantaloon pants, tall boots, you know? He's a bear of a man. Witte wrote about him as if, you know, he might not have been the smartest stone on the block, but boy, did he have a heart. And he ruled through emotion. And he was a rock of granite. You could rely on him. He was always thinking about the son, someone you couldn't rely on because, after all, he fired Witte eventually from power. Senseless dreams. But I want to introduce that not simply to basically entertain you with stories of the royal house, but also to kind of introduce a basic word. Because if we've been talking a lot about an age of empire, we now really have to think for a moment or two about an age of ideology. And ideology is really a loaded word, right? But if you think about ideology, ideology ultimately becomes a governing vision, a way for people to actually understand the present in terms of a past that has produced it, and as a set of markers that actually are predictive of what the future will look like. So whether, especially if you put it in our terms today, this morning, right? Whether you are a progressive or a liberal or a conservative or a Tea Partier or an apolitical agnostic, all of us would probably be able to immediately join into a debate about what the defining characteristics of each one of those words actually happen to be. Because all of them, in some fashion or another, are ideological in character. All of them demarcate an ideological worldview. It's an age of ideology, and it's an age that's beginning here. And you could actually say, for starters, because I also want to introduce more than just autocracy here, that autocracy was emerging by the end of the 19th century itself as an ideology. Count Uvadov, under Nicholas I, remember, had written about autocracy, orthodoxy, and narodnost, official nationality, as the pillars, as the foundations of a traditional autocratic, imperial, and ultimately peasant order in the Russian Empire. You can look, historians have, at court ritual, and in the way in which the emperors and their families, look at all that film. And what was going on in that film wasn't just, you know, oh, cool, I have my home video camera and I can take a picture of the Romanovs. The Romanovs were on display. They were being literally displayed as a source of legitimacy, as a symbol of legitimate political power and political authority. So here's actually, you know, an attempt to characterize the ideology of autocracy, which, and here basically you have to just take my word for it, in a room like this, given the sociological status represented here, the jobs that you either still have or had, given the wealth that's actually represented here, and given basically the lifetimes that are represented here, which are lifetimes in some fashion or another of influence in this society, some significant minority of this room would actually buy into this ideology totally. Totally. Right? Unrestricted autocratic rule. That's the good of the nation. Understood as a dynasty, as a dynastic monarchy. And the rational, again, right, this is all formalized and idealized, the rational bureaucratic state through which that dynastic monarchy actually ruled for the good of the country. Therefore, by definition, the whole notion of popular sovereignty, the first three words in the preamble of the United States Constitution, we the people, popular sovereignty, is illegitimate. Nation as a word, natia, was formally, although this is increasingly difficult to pull off, formally prescribed by the censorship. You had to find Aesopian language to actually, in fact, talk about the political nation in an age of nationalism as well. Socially, culturally, politically as well, this ideology rested on an understanding of ultimately of an agrarian world. An agrarian world that by definition was conservative, that valued stability, that valued tradition, that valued the past, and that valued the anchor that kept such a world stable and together, valued the privilege of the ruling class, but I'm not bound to that word at all. The elite. Verkhushka is another word in Russian. It basically just means, the top, like the ceiling. Verkhushka, the elite in that sense. That valued internal order, so порядок, order. And you can find babushki in that country today who will walk up to young people and, как вам не стыдно? How are you not embarrassed by that sort of behavior? Look at your hair. Look at the way you're behaving. Punky, these punks. And that's not just like the punks. This is actually a reference to the way people dress, right? And the music that they actually listen to. Nothing prized more than, in many circles of this country, even today, internal order, and therefore the necessity of a firm hand, a firm internal police force and police power to ultimately to enforce it. An emphasis upon an imperial nationalism. The Romanovs, after all, are Russian in a multicultural, multi-confessional, and multi-ethnic empire. So while this is an empire, the place of ethnic Russian culture, ethnic Russian language, and ethnic Russians in it is privileged. And hence you can think about shorthanding in imperial nationalism. And ultimately, of course, what finally grounds all of this is the empire itself. A unitary empire. One grand imperial space, which in the thinking of someone like Sergei Witte equated to one grand space for the development of industrial wealth, and therefore one grand space for the development of imperial power, which if you think about that grand space would be in the new coming 20th century unrivaled on the continent and possibly in the world as well. Well, those are a set of ideas, actually, that, in fact, you could find them anywhere, I would argue, anywhere from Peter the Great on. I mean, you'd have to sort of edit around a little bit to make up for the changing time. And certainly, ideology in the beginning of the 18th century is not a word that most historians would apply with any sort of willingness or any sort of confidence, because you really have to get to this modern era in order for that word to begin to make sense. But still, a universal set of values in some way or another. And what ensues, and there's no other way of doing this than this, right, is a tumultuous period of time. For the sake of the argument, from the time that Nicholas comes to the throne, actually, from the last years of his father's reign, 1890, 1891, when those ideas that I just put on the board and senseless dreams are givens, to 1906, when the first State Duma actually convenes in April, the first parliament to ever sit in Russia. This is a real long roller coaster ride. And really all this conveys, and I'm not going to walk through this in detail, is a story that takes up, well, depending on the subject of the book, minimally one and typically multiple chapters. A Great Famine in 1891, 1892, which afflicted upwards of 16 provinces in the Volga River Valley, one of the main grain-growing breadbaskets of the entire, actually of the entire part of the eastern side of the European continent. A 2-year crop failure, accompanied by cholera epidemic, witness Haiti, but put it inside, millions and millions of people that resulted in mortality rates 25% above normal in some local areas. Cholera and famine like that didn't happen in modern states. And this famine had a galvanizing impact on public opinion and an evolving, birthing civic society, as did the death of a czar, as did the coronation of a new one, as did the explosion, here was something new, of industrial strikes that paralyzed for upwards of 3 months one of the major industrial branches of the imperial capital of St. Petersburg, and really brought to the fore a social group that I put up in the slideshow, and because oftentimes we're either disconnected with it or, ask Vanderbilt students, how many of you come from blue-collar families? And they all sit here like this. But there's always somebody, right? There always is someone. But, you know, basically just given the sociology both of the classroom and of the society, typically that's less the case. When I went to school in Ann Arbor, you always ran into people who worked in the auto plants in the summertime. That was a plum job. They had all sorts of funny stories to tell, which explained why it was that GM and the American auto industry ended up where it did by recent years, right? But there's less and less of that today. But this begins a major public period, a new period of Russian history. The Trans-Siberian is actually being constructed from the early 1890s onward. My guy is in charge of the project and driving it like a maniac because he wants to get the Pacific Coast. They're building a transcontinental railroad across Canada, across the United States, and now across Eurasia. And they come up with a great idea. The hardest part of the construction project, and I believe I have a map here to switch. Oops. No, I don't. It's further on down the line, sorry. The hardest part of the construction project is in the east, and so a shortcut presents itself. Well, I've got a good idea. Let's drive a line across Manchuria. Let's drive a line across China. Imperial power. Russian power in the east. We can finance it. We can build facade banks to actually organize the project. We can exercise diplomacy to force the Chinese imperial government to accept the deal. They're being pressed by Japan. We can build it. They build it. It leads actually to first financial, diplomatic, and ultimately military conflict in the Far East. Look at the way basically that this all, as the century turns, begins to accelerate. Industrial depression, always bad news. Chinese Boxer uprising in the Far East. Much of it actually, in fact, initially targeted on, you know, the famous siege of European embassies in the imperial capital of Beijing. But most of it originally focused on the Russian branch railroad that's being driven across Manchuria, which is essentially the homeland of the Chinese dynastic ruling house. Strikes, peasant riots, assassination, political violence re-emerging again. Not only in industrial areas, but in the countryside as well, although, you know, riots. But riots basically mean, especially if you live in a conservative agrarian world where internal order is preserved and prized above all else, peasants basically running riot and going crazy in local areas because they don't like the labor contract or they don't like the local economic social contract that's been established, or they're protesting, my words, not theirs, but it still makes sense, the local political economy that keeps the majority population on the bottom and a minority on top. They riot. And suddenly this is happening, and the government has to investigate this because somebody's got to explain it to Nicholas. What's going on out there? Why is this happening? War. Always an antidote. War with Japan in 1904. And the outburst, really, of what I also want to talk about today, a first revolution, the revolution of 1905. That will eventually lead to these last three events that we'll hear more about today. Bloody Sunday, the Manifesto of 17 October, which actually grants the population civil rights tacitly, hesitatingly, recognizes popular sovereignty, and establishes a state Duma. Not a consultative assembly that will advise the emperor on what he ought to do, but a parliamentary structure that will, by law, be required to tell the emperor what the people thinks he should do. And it's opening in 1906. What we're really talking about, I suppose, one way of framing this is we're talking about the dawn of an era of national politics, a modern political age. And here's basically, you know, let's start thinking about other competing ideologies, because that is, after all, the mark of a modern political age, a conflict of ideas, a marketplace of ideological ideas. And here's typically a marker that's thrown up to actually, in fact, get people to think about the ideas that actually are now filtering up and percolating up from the population. Remember Nicholas's quote. These are senseless dreams. I mean, this quote is practically, for an American audience, banal. It's so much a given. Now, for reasons that today we're not going to go into, socialism's in the first sentence only because Marxism is such a compelling ideological explanation for everything. In the 19th century, an age of unitary theory, where does Einstein come from if not an attempt, in fact, to describe all natural order and the laws by which it operates? Where does Freud come from if not an attempt to understand the human psyche itself and thus all of human society? Where does Darwin come from if not a unitary theory that attempts to actually explain the origin of species? And however kooky Marx might have been, when you actually read him, what you see is an attempt to explain the reality of present-day industrial capitalism, where it came from and where it's inevitably headed. Complete with an understanding of history, complete with an understanding of economy, and complete with an understanding of sociology. You can't do modern social science without actually, at some point or another, claiming that you've cracked Marx, even if you've never read him. It's just the way it is, Political freedom is not only the first step toward the achievement of socialism, hence that reference, but also the first principle of its existence. The party, and this is an underground group, which is coming out of a tradition of an idea that political violence is the only way to achieve change in Russia. And these are a group of intellectuals, writers, professors, columnists, professionals, lawyers. The party has set itself the task of uniting all oppositional elements in the country and organizing an active force which should attain the overthrow of autocracy. Blow it up? Well, or in fact, secure for everyone the rights of citizen and man. This is a direct reference to the declaration in 1789 of the French National Assembly. What do these rights include? Representative government on the basis of universal suffrage. Everybody is privileged. One man, still, one vote. Although there are already people here who are thinking about the fact that universal suffrage means universal suffrage, not just as the wags would have it, not just history, but herstory as well. Basic civil liberties. My undergraduates actually always, you can tell, it's actually happening in here too because this is long and slogging, right? People begin to nod at this point. And the thing is that if you say, wow, basic civil liberties, rights of conscience, assembly, personal inviolability. You can't have a policeman kicking in your door or handing you a warrant saying, I can search whatever I want. And then you look out at the audience of undergrads and, they're texting away and, some of them are like this and all the rest of it. And, it's a disconnect of sorts. Although it's interesting to ponder that this is 1893. In human historical time, this is nothing. It's 100 years ago, a little bit more. National self-determination for all the nationalities entering into the composition of the Russian Empire. Basically, the birth of modern politics and the birth of basic demands that fundamentally challenge unrestricted autocratic ideology. I'm going to skip this. You can also basically see it break into three very different governing ideologies that themselves are beginning to spawn constituencies, proto-constituencies. Leaderships, proto-political leaderships. And because all of this is illegal, popular sovereignty is still illegitimate. All of this is illegal. Even proto-political organizations, even though many of them are underground, or many of them would be taking place in lecture halls like this, where ideas are being put forward. In the first case, 19th century liberalism. All right, you want to get liberalism, you read John Stuart Mill on liberty. Right? You can do whatever you want just as long as you don't inhibit my right to do whatever I want. And that's basically where the social contract begins. And the only way to enforce it is through the rule of law. Not the rule of men, but the rule of law. Such a society fundamentally rests on the notion of inviolability And that notion, in turn, is one person, one castle, right? A man's house is his castle, the inviolability of private property. Fundamental civil liberties, which naturally follow from the right of owning and holding property as your own. To your person, to your speech, to your conscience, and basically to your right to assemble with other people. Representative government, and for these guys, constitutional monarchy. You know, this isn't like flame-throwing radicalism that says, let's kill the czar. These are all people of property. Look at what they're after, right? But they look to England principally, and I say, let's be like them. Although some of them are already beginning to think, when they say representative government and universal male suffrage, they're looking to France, a Republican form of government, or they're definitely looking to the United States, or to Canada. More of them, actually, interestingly enough, are looking to Canada, where the crown is increasingly removed from Canadian politics and Canadian life, and democratic and proto-republican forms of government are being put in place, but there's still always a sovereign to ensure some sort of final firewall, some sort of final source of order. And definitely for these guys, the preservation of the empire, whether that's the unitary empire or a recognition of nationalism in some form of federation, well, here is a governing ideology. This is what Russia should look like in the future. And the fact that it doesn't look like this now, of course, requires you to develop a vocabulary that you can talk and think this way. And that's the product of the previous 100 years. But this is what it ought to look like. And if you reference that previous quotation, this is what it will look like. And it definitely won't look like a world of unrestricted autocratic ideology. Yes, sir?
I assume the church continues to side with the nobility.
With the state, I think, would probably be the fair way of putting it, and with the dynasty and the empire, but as a part of that with the nobility as well. I mean, I think that probably when you're thinking about the church, excuse me, especially its hierarchy, there is no separation of church and state within the empire. And part of what I called imperial nationalism, the privileging of Russian ethnicity and Russian culture, also includes the privileging of Russian orthodoxy. You can practice other confessions within the empire. They're not persecuted, although they're governed and regulated. But in that sense, when these guys are thinking about the place of the church, and there's two others to follow, they're not thinking of the church as part and parcel of this world. If anything, they're thinking of what I guess we would call a secular world, and a secular world that, you know, is being extracted from an old regime in which state and church, much like in the Germanies, Protestant Lutheranism and Protestant princes in the Germanies in the 16th and even into the 17th century. I mean, actually in Germany across the board, you know, where the church hasn't really developed a tradition of resistance to illegitimate rule, but rather basically, as you know, said along with St. Paul, the king wields the sword in an evil human world. These guys are actually, you know, these guys, I don't want to call them secularists because that would do injustice to it, but you know, here's, if that's an explanation for our contemporary reality that rings true to you in a way, here's a beginning of that kind of secularism in the Russian context. And certainly that question about the church would apply to liberals, it would apply to social democrats, and it would apply to populists. I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly, or otherwise we're never going to get to 1914. But, you know, a very powerful emerging ideology by the 1890s. And important, if for no other reason than this guy down in the bottom, Ulyanov, better known to history as Vladimir Lenin, is one by the middle part of the 1890s, young still, as one of its major adherents and proponents. Now, you know, I mean, basically read this platform and put this platform within the social context toward which it's aimed, which is largely toward a lower class, working class population in the cities, at this time to a much lesser extent to peasants in the countryside. Marx famously or infamously proclaimed that peasants basically were politically sacks of potatoes. They had no political consciousness. They were, they were loyal to the crown no matter where you were in Europe. As far as Marx were concerned, they were all stupid. This is something that politically has to be reversed in the early 20th century. Universal, equal, and direct suffrage, essentially for all men and women. Freedoms not only of conscience and assembly, but of unionization and of the ability to strike. An 8-hour day. This one, actually, Vandy undergrads really pay attention to as soon as you start to explain it. Basically for them, right, the notion of an 8-hour day sometimes, it seems, is really crazy, although depending on the part of the year, they'll have a 24-hour day. But the objective here oftentimes is, I have a really great class. It runs from schedule. It runs from Monday until Thursday, so I can have Friday off. Now, the notion that somehow or another people would, in fact, protest politically over an 8-hour day or a 42-hour respite, i.e. a weekend, that actually begins someplace late on Saturday. My grandparents worked on all-day Saturday. Their weekend began at 6 p.m. when we went to church on Saturday night, or when they just basically knocked off, is absolutely terra incognita to 18-year-olds. Explain to them that people typically worked a 14 to 16-hour days, and that therefore an 8-hour day was a radical demand of empowerment. The texting in the room stops. Right? Because that, of course, they get. And you could note as well here an attempt to begin to appeal. Liberalism by 1905 will develop, all of these ideologies will develop this appeal, an attempt to appeal to the countryside, to return to the emancipation settlement and correct those aspects of it that are deemed to be unjust. Another way of looking at the world. Yes, this guy here. Plekhanov is the old man of Russian social democracy and actually is responsible for translating and early on, not for the first translator, but early on writing about Marxist theory and actually bringing social democracy as an underground political organization into the country in the 1880s. And Lenin, this young guy on the bottom, this is a police photograph of him because he's arrested in 1896 for labor organization actually during the textile strikes in St. Petersburg, and he's exiled to Siberia. So this is a lineup shot. This is Lenin. He'll escape from Siberian exile and make his way to Europe, where he basically spends most of his time. Very brief interlude of less than a year in late 1904 and 1905, and will only return to Russia in April of 1917. Yeah.
I'm reading by Democratic Republic. Can you describe a Democratic Republic?
Yes. No monarchy.
We don't know how to have one here, but I'm just wondering.
Well, but we have one. I mean, you could. I'm not going to argue the point, but basically, if this is poli-sci 101, typically a democratic republic that is a polity where all citizens, defined with some qualifications, where all citizens have the franchise, which in turn is a mark of citizenship and a mark of popular sovereignty, we the people, right? With republican forms of government, which are, as the Federalists intended it, were intended to guard against mob rule. So, I mean, basically 100 senators represent the entire population of however 200 and however many million we are at this point or another, right? Institutions in place to assure political order and what Aristotle called the golden mean, right? The middle ground, right? To preserve tradition and continuity over time so that we're not subject to the vicissitudes of the moment, right? And in that sense, a democratic republic, right? And certainly in this context, it meant no monarchy. It meant a constituent assembly, basically a constitutional convention that would summon the population, thinking very much about 1789 in the United States and other places, to write a new constitution for a democratic and republican order, although republic also has echoes back to the French Revolution as well, and the kind of Jacobin violence, right, of that republican tradition. So whether we have one or not today, the very fact that we're arguing about it, I suppose, and I'm not trying to be cute in terms of the answer, the very fact that we're arguing about exactly, so what are the definitions of, and do we still have one or not, would, also harkens back to this. But this is hence a very different and starkly radical alternative to the world of unrestricted autocratic authority. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean, actually, it's the standard in Europe. England, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Sultan, who is a monarch in the Ottoman Empire, the Chinese Emperor. It's actually, empire is the lay of the land, right? So in that sense, Latin America is different. There are republican forms of government, although oftentimes they're authoritarian and dictatorial, the United States, and especially France.
So there really wasn't, they weren't the last guy.
Absolutely correct. Right. I mean, oftentimes, and in fact, oftentimes, even these contemporaries are drawing comparisons back and forth between themselves and England. England or France, oftentimes it's that way, right? And these folks, of course, aren't going to look to England by definition because England has a monarchy. And it's not up here, I'll put it up in the next slide, but when you put George V and Nicholas II up next to each other, they're cousins through Victorian. They look exactly alike, Right, they wear the same uniforms, the families are all interconnected and intermarried. It's an age of empire, right? It's a given. Yes? Yes. Absolutely, and I'm sorry. Yeah, there's an interlude going on over here with this half of the hall, and I'm sorry I forgot. So the first question was basically, this isn't a unique, it's not that empire only exists in Russia, it exists across Europe, doesn't it? And my response was, yes, indeed it does. And then a question that I interrupted, so I'm going to summarize, but if I didn't get to the whole question, it's not to disagree, but there's a real difference, isn't there, between constitutional monarchy in the United Kingdom under Victoria and her successors and unrestricted autocratic authority and imperial rule in Russia? Yes, absolutely. So that when Russian liberals in particular look for analogs around the continent, they'll tend not to look to France, but to look to England, which is a country that, after all, not only has a king, but has a nobility, has an aristocracy, has a gentry, but has the rule of law, and has the inviolability of private property, and above all else has a parliament that actually, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, is no longer this set of sort of corrupt pocket representations, but largely through good English evolutionary law has established universal male suffrage for all practical purposes, right? Even though it's still regulated, wealth and property ownership and whatnot. But basically, if you're male and you're above 18, odds are by the time the new century begins, you're probably voting. That's an analog for a monarchical order that is seeking to modernize itself politically, right? And so they'll look to England for that purpose. There's actually a populism as well, which I just put up here, and I want to move through it quickly, but an agrarian populism that has deep roots in the countryside. Deep roots in the countryside because principally its main idea is significant, i.e. radical land reform. Nationalization of private property doesn't mean I'm going to take all your property away, but it does mean the state's going to own it and can exercise the right of eminent domain over it, particularly if this is the instrument required to assure a more equitable distribution of private property, arable land, wealth, and the foundation for economic productivity in rural areas of the empire. This is an idea that in the peasant mind, I'm for the SRs. I mean, if there's a political consciousness in the Russian village after the turn of the century, in the first 20 years of the 20th century, if there's a political consciousness, and we'll talk more about this next time, the political consciousness is that I'm for these guys. I don't think very many of them say that, but I'm for these guys largely because their entire understanding of society is rooted in the foundation of the village and its chief and basic desire and demand. More land. Land's my source of wealth. Land's my source of status. Land's my source of security. Land's my source for the future. Land makes me a bolshak. Land makes me a big shot. And I can have a whole string of children behind me. If the Lord blesses me, they'll be sons and not daughters. But if the Lord really blesses me, they'll be sons and daughters, and I can use the daughters and marry them off to other bolshaki, other big shots, just like me, and brace my power and status and standing and prestige in the village. So a party that's thinking about land, and I guarantee you by 1905 they're all thinking about land, is thinking about, so how do you make the peasantry, who after all Marx called sacks of potato, how do you make them politically active and part of your constituency in this evolving world of modern politics? Think about the very question that's being asked. Peasants as constituents? That wasn't asked under Nicholas I. Even Alexander III. Мы и народ, we, the royal we and the people. Not we, the people, we and the people. And here are people who by, within the decade are thinking about peasantry as constituents. All right, so now basically having looked at all of these ideas, I want to try to now spin them into motion. And I told you and warned you this is a roller coaster, right? And to look at war, revolution, and constitutional monarchy, 1904, 1914. Where we have to get is, here's a political cartoon from England portraying what's happening as Russia goes to war with Japan in January of 1904. Following actually a Japanese attack on a Russian naval squadron at a base in Korea called Port Arthur. Actually exactly the same strategy that was utilized against the United States at Pearl Harbor. War begins. It's a war that Nicholas infamously is advised by his chief domestic affairs minister, Vyacheslav von Pleva, that a small victorious war against those yellow Japs, you'll pardon me for that sort of racialist slur, but that's basically what's in the source. Actually, it's entirely possible we'll beat them, and it's going to actually, in fact, it'll vent off all of this internal discontent. Nothing like victory, nothing like war, to draw people's attention away from problems at home. Hence Nicholas standing on a sewer with a crazy bomb-throwing anarchist trying to escape from it, armed against the encroaching little, caricatured Japanese soldier. It ends in defeat, as we'll see in a second, and it leads to this sort of domestic political cartoon. Late 1904, early 1905, Освобождающаяся Россия. Russia being emancipated, literally, this reads, right? Zarya, the dawn, Zarya Svobody, the dawn of freedom. I mean, these basically are metaphors that by 1904, especially 1905, are suffusing the discourse of the empire. No censorship at all. In 1890, the newspapers, you'll pardon me, suck as a historical source. The censorship is so hard. By 1904, 1905, they're the best. And not only are they filled with really good source material for whatever it is that you're writing on, but the advertisements, for example, are spectacular. So anytime you really get burned out in front of the microfilm machine, you can switch to the other side of the newspaper, and they're advertising everything. In 1906, a play, Chaos, chaos, which more or less captured the spirit of the time and gets us to the opening of the First State Duma in April of 1906. Key to this story is the construction of the Trans-Siberian. And this was the map that I was wildly searching around for, trying to find. You know, a single spur, a transcontinental, that connects European and Asiatic Russia. That's certainly in the way that it's framed in its bureaucratic justification. You know, you read the archives, and you got to basically justify spending tens of millions, hundreds of millions of rubles to build this thing. It's the conduit between civilized Europe and the Pacific. It will be the channel through which the commerce of Asia and Europe will flow. It will assert our interests, our legitimate interests, in the Far East, which, depending on who you're talking to, a general is construed militarily, a finance minister is construed commercially and economically. And if you're an engineer, and presumably somebody in here is, you look at this and you say, wow. Because this is a monster construction project. Talk about infrastructure, right? This is infrastructure par excellence, but it also leads you, and here's the branch line in particular. You can see where it says Amur, A-M-U-R. The route is supposed to follow the river and then come down to Vladivostok. But the shortcut goes across Manchuria and eventually leads to a base at Port Arthur and a branch line there as well. And the establishment of a Pacific squadron, which is directly challenging. You can't quite make it out, but it's there on the outskirts and here on the next slide, directly challenges an equally powerful empire in the East, the Empire of Japan. One of them, actually, that when you asked about the Age of Empire, I forgot, right? This is the modernizing empire par excellence, right? I mean, we all know this story from Shogun and whatnot, right? But basically, you know, here's an empire which, in fact, has embraced Western European technology, dress, mores, just like this, right? And the fact that these two come into conflict by 1904 is a major piece of global history, as is the defeat that the empire actually suffers at the hands of Japan. Unprecedented defeat, actually, with echoes back to Crimea. Remember what happened to Nicholas I when he went to war at Crimea. There's always this connection in Russian history between war and domestic unrest and domestic discontent. You saw it with Crimea and the death of Nicholas I. You will, in the next 10 minutes, archly see it here. You will, next week, even more archly see it with the First World War and the 1917 Revolution, and just ask Mikhail Gorbachev about the connection between war, in this case in the 1980s in Afghanistan, and domestic unrest and discontent, i.e. 1989 and 1991 and the disappearance of the country that actually got me grant money, the disappearance of the Soviet Union. A key moment, actually, in the record of the war, which is much longer and much more complex than I'm painting it here, is the Battle of Tsushima. So the defeat of a Pacific squadron in the winter of 1904 leads to a plan, which I just can't get harebrained out of my mind. And I basically read around this and looked at source material on this, and sort of the notion that you could actually take a fleet that was built to assert Russian naval power in the Baltic Sea and had been built at quite great expense from the 1890s onward. This is the age of the dreadnought as well. So everybody, to be a great power, everybody's building high seas fleets. And that you could dispatch this fleet all the way around the world. And you can see from the map the number of times it actually had to stop. And famously or infamously, even, you know, when they exited the Baltic into the North Sea, they encountered a fleet of British fishing trawlers, and open fire on them in the fog, sparking a diplomatic incident that always does become something of a punchline in this lecture, you know? I mean, it's designed almost as a laugh line because it seems like, and this is just like stupid. And by the time they actually get to the Pacific Ocean, you know, these ships are trailing barnacles and they're not really very well equipped to fight, but really what they're doing is they're sailing to Japan to do battle with the Japanese High Fleet. And the Russian fleet is summarily destroyed in the course of a couple hours one afternoon. 36 of 45 ships lost, 6,000 sailors killed. And actually, if the equation of war and domestic discontent is set in your mind, the equation becomes important not because war, but because war that leads to military defeat delegitimates the ruling authority and the ruling power, which can't even lay claim to defending the motherland in Crimea, against Japan, against the Germans, against the Afghans. So, is there any commentary about the incompetence of the Russian naval command? By the time you get to this episode, it's largely blamed on that, although the chief commanding admiral of the squadron, a guy named Rozdin Zvensky, is actually considered to be a strategist and a capable tactician who saddled ultimately with an unrealizable strategy. The chief fighting officer in the Imperial Navy was actually posted to the Pacific Squadron and was killed early on in the war in the winter of 1904. So those are, I'm not a military historian, but those are two of the brackets when you actually start looking at the concrete military history of this operation that tends to blame this sort of defeat on an imperial high command that comes up with a strategy, and it's an imperial high command that ultimately is under the influence of the Romanov family. So the Tsar is making these decisions ultimately, as are his uncles, one of whom is the admiral-in-chief, the naval minister of the empire, and then basically tactics, and ultimately the Japanese fleet itself, which outperforms, outguns, out-strategizes the Russian fleet, resulting in this sort of disastrous military defeat. Domestic discontent and the importance of a working class population. So a famous or infamous event then becomes Bloody Sunday in early January 1905, the 9th of January of 1905. Petersburg is built in such a way, if you've been to the city and been to the Winter Palace or the downtown part of the city along the Neva, all of that is aristocratic and civil officialdom and business. There's a city, actually, as in London, a business district downtown. And the industrial districts outline and encircle the city, and those are industrial slums. Suburbs, oftentimes, they're called, although you can get there today by subway or by tram or by bus. And in January of 1905, actually organized by a union that itself is inspired by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, an official union that unofficially is organizing workers in an attempt to control or buy off what is increasingly being recognized as working class discontent. A rogue element in this union, a priest, Georgi George Gapon, organizes a march and organizes a workers' petition. I want to put the petition up on the board in a second. A march that basically advertises, let's take our pleas to the Little Father. Let's go to the Tsar. Let's take the people to the Tsar. Let's march to the Winter Palace. And these processions set off on Sunday morning, religious hymns, Bože Zarya Chrani, the national anthem being sung, priests, icons, and all the rest. Although there's an argument in the literature that a lot of this is actually constructed, a deliberately constructed provocation, knowing exactly how the ham-handed civil officialdom is going to respond. They open fire. And this event results in over 100 deaths. Look at the petition, though. Not only, sire, hear us. Ignore those corrupt officials. Hear us. And hear what we want. Now, who's writing this? People sign it, so you can find actually, in the archives it's preserved. You can see these sort of scrawled signatures, sometimes not all that literate, but basically if you're a peasant coming from the countryside into the city, odds are you're literate. You can read and you can write. You're a city guy sometimes, just in one generation, actually in the course of 10 years. Check me out. Look at how I'm dressed. I mean, you find this in workers' memoirs. So who's actually writing this, it's difficult to say, but you can see basically a set of proposals that address politics, that address economics, and that address the very specific demands of industrial labor, which of course in an industrial economy, it's a given that there are going to be such demands. The government opens fire on these people. This is not taken kindly. So the Ministry of Finances tracks all this kind of stuff. And you can see strike statistics. And you can see that in the previous decade before 1904, the government registered 1,765 labor actions. And in the course of 1 month following Bloody Sunday, there's more than there was in an entire decade previously to that. And these are spread across all of the major industrial regions of the country. And because they pay attention to this sort of stuff, they actually they classify strike actions by the demands that are proffered. Are they economic or are they political? And economic is 8-hour working day, better working conditions. Foremen, many of whom are foreign, cannot address me with the personal pronoun, as in German, so too in Russian. Ty is you. For me to use that, to call you ty would be a scandal in a room like this, despite the fact that we're not all that far separated in age. By definition, I would never call one of my students by the personal pronoun. I would always address them as vous, even if the 18-year-old was driving me half raving mad by their childlike behavior, because only children are called that as a mark of endearment or of disrespect. Routinely, workers are called ty, especially females, especially by foreign foremen, who are technically more adept. So those are economic demands. But of course, that economic demand already, address me with respect. That's an economic demand or a political demand? And political strikes that actually have political slogans, representation, civil rights, the workers' petition from Bloody Sunday, these political demands actually are now growing at the beginning of the year. As is the war, Sergei Witte actually goes to Portsmouth, Maine to negotiate peace. Theodore Roosevelt actually gets a Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the peace. Witte actually wins a diplomatic victory at the peace table over Japan that was really undeserved given Russia's poor position on the battlefield in the summer of 1905. And he comes home to Russia from America, and later in his notebooks remembers what it was like to come home. This is my note from this passage. So he remembered. I do want to read this. He remembered arriving home in mid-September and finding Russia in total upheaval, with the revolution breaking out of the underground into the open. This is a man of the Ancien regime. Here's a man who actually knew 2 emperors personally. Here's a man who was a corporate railway executive as well. Here's a man who oversaw the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The government had lost the initiative as officials ceased to act or contradicted each other, ensuring that the authority of the existing regime and its supreme standard bearer entirely was trampled. Smuta, troubles, chaos. It's a word that basically is filled with meaning in Russian for, total nutsiness and chaos and anarchy. Smuta grew not by the day but by the hour. A revoluция. It's prescribed by the censorship. A revoluция leapt out onto the street ever more ominously. It was enticing, and here's the main thing, all classes of the population. And he's just like befuddled ultimately fascinated, actually, by this. Modern man that he is. It's a sociological laboratory. The entire upper class was dissatisfied and embittered. How could that be? They benefit from the system. University and even high school youth rejected all authority but that of those preaching the most radical revolutionary and anti-state theories in lecture halls like this one. Much of the professoriate proclaimed, enough. Everything has to be overturned. Liberals, many of them nobles. This goes on and on. All non-Russian aliens, some 35% of the entire population, saw authority weakening and concluded the time had come to realize their dreams and desires. You know? Absolutely Poles for autonomy. Absolutely Jews for equal rights. Absolutely all national groups in an age of dawning nationalism for the elimination of all legal restrictions upon national identity and national freedom. Peasants, even petty officials, clerks, the army. Она военное государство. She's a military state. Even the army was agitated. One could say without any exaggeration, Witte concluded that all Russia had been swept up in the Troubles and that the general slogan was a cry from the soul, «Дальше так жить нельзя». To live like this any longer, нельзя, is impossible. So the question becomes, how do you, in fact, achieve, how do you get out of this? Wholesale chaos. You find memoirs, memoirists, especially bureaucrats, and I'm summing up in the next 3 minutes, you find bureaucrats actually, in fact, oftentimes using the metaphor of standing at the edge of the precipice and looking over. But that's how close things were coming. And it's that actually that in October forces Nicholas ultimately to part with what in 1895 he had called a senseless dream, to part with a portion of his inheritance and sign the October Manifesto, which we can't go through, but essentially is a promise of basic civil rights and a parliamentary structure that grants legislative power to elected representatives of the population, that produces not what Witte, who is the architect of these ideas, promised his boss and his emperor would be a calming of unrest in the country, but produces a further explosion of social unrest, especially in the countryside, throughout the autumn, winter, and spring of 05, 06. This one in particular, 1,000 estates and 32 million rubles worth of property damages registered on specifically noble estates in major agricultural regions of the country in the course of just a couple of months, as the peasants basically hear svoboda, freedom, and they begin to act on their own definition of what that actually means. And one thing it means is that the land, it's all mine. It's not yours. What do we need you for? How do we ensure we get rid of you? Oh, I know. We burn you out. Then you'll never come back. And particularly with the army mainly in Manchuria, there's actually very little military force available to actually put this down. So even the bayonet is lacking. It's Witte's accomplishment, and here, you're going to have to take my word for it because I am running over. It's Witte's accomplishment that he's actually, in fact, able to pull the chestnuts out of the fire. This is a conservative national daily, Novaya Vremya, the New Times. Nicholas reads it every day. Great source in 1905. It's an anti-Semitic newspaper as well in parts. It's got an editorial line that actually incorporates anti-Semitism into it, part and parcel basically of Russian public discourse at the time. Here's Witte riding a Russian troika. It might even be the place to end. It's a deliberate evocation actually of a scene from Dead Souls, Nikolai Gogol's novel written in the 1840s. And Gogol ends this novel, which is about a petty clerk, a man named Chichikov. And Chichikov basically has figured out that the system is so backward and corrupt that you can actually go around and buy from befuddled noblemen serfs who are still registered on his or her estate, but who are dead. And by buying them, you can raise your own social status. What's he doing? How does he know about this deal? And he's a major serf owner. Look how many souls he actually owns. But he owns, as Gogol entitled the book, dead souls. Well, Chichikov gets found out and he lights out of town, and he lights out of town in a troika. That's what this is, the Russian sleigh and the 3 horses and all of the rest. And Gogol ends with this final paragraph about the tinkling of the troika's bells and the rushing of the wind as the troika breezes by people and knocks them aside. And it's, that any Russian would see this and wonder in 1840s, whither thou, Russia? Because it was an ending that in some way or another was an ending about a future of promise. Although, interestingly enough, a future of, that included entrepreneurial con, business acumen with a good deal of graft and corruption written into it as well. Well, here's Chichikov's troika again. Here's Gogol's troika with the different Chichikov, Sergei Witte, the first prime minister of the imperial state. And these horses are, in the conservative estimation, are named around the yoke of each horse. One of them is called Revoluция, one of them is called Constituция, and one of them is called Anarchia. And you can hear the cognates in it: revolution, constitution, and anarchy. And it's one way of thinking about, we're going to take this up again next time, it's one way of thinking about the impasse that Russia had reached. It had created constitutional institutions. And it had, in fact, managed to escape the threat of wholesale destruction posed by a first revolution. And yet, at the same time, it had left hanging a whole set of questions about not only the stability of the present, but the stability of the future as well. What would this, in fact, yield? Would it yield constitution and stability? Would it yield further revolution? Or would it yield anarchy? And those answers, of course, we have to hold for next week because the crowd's beating down the door for lecture 6. Thank you.